Evelyn Morgan never imagined a night would come when she would stand on a curb clutching two suitcases and feel as though the world had simply moved on without her. She had raised her life around a husband, a home, and a daughter, small, steady pillars that steadied her even when the wind of life gusted hard. Until they were gone. "My name is Evelyn," she told herself in the motel's dim light, trying on the sound of it like an unfamiliar dress. 58. Recently widowed, and suddenly invisible in a city she had helped shape with holiday dinners, carefully sewn curtains, and bank accounts balanced on an uneasy optimism. Her husband, Thomas Morgan, had been gone 8 months. Cancer had taken him with a quiet, industrious cruelty. The town had been sympathetic at the funeral. Casseroles arrived that first week, visits dwindled after the second. But Evelyn had counted on one constant, her daughter, Claire. Claire's marriage to Ryan Hale had always been rocky in ways that didn't show in polite conversation. Ryan, with his easy charm and simmering impatience, had always blended into the background of family dinners like oil and water, only noticeable when he was missing or when he spilled. Evelyn had loved her daughter fiercely. She'd made sacrifices Claire would never notice, and she'd hidden fears beneath smiles because a mother's job was to protect and to forgive. When the mortgage was finally paid off on the house Evelyn and Thomas built in Willowbend, a 2-story with roses climbing the porch, Thomas's illness still took what it wanted. With the house sold and the sun setting on her small, ordered life, Claire invited Evelyn to stay at their apartment, just for a little while. Evelyn, bruised by grief and hollow as a flute, accepted because sometimes a little while is all you have when sorrow reaches into your chest and squeezes. At first, she thought it could be temporary. Claire's voice had quivered as she offered her mother the spare room. "It's just until you get back on your feet, Mom," she'd said. Their apartment was tucked in an older complex near the river, a place where neighbors knew each other by names and raised voices. Ryan barely looked up from his phone when Evelyn arrived with boxes and awkward quiet. He was a man who measured his kindness by convenience. He allowed Evelyn into the house, but kept his distance like a window kept ajar in case the breeze became a storm. The small humiliations were the worst. An eye roll when Evelyn asked where something was. The TV click when her favorite program came on. A whispered freeloader one night that Evelyn could not unhear. Claire explained away his behavior as stress. "He's been under a lot of pressure at work," she said, or "he's not sleeping well." Evelyn accepted these explanations because hope for her daughter's goodness was easier than the truth. The truth arrived that winter, at the dinner table over a chicken pot pie Evelyn had painstakingly made. Ryan's beer steamed in the dim light. Claire scrolled through her phone, lips barely moving. Then Ryan lifted his head and said, flat and precise enough to cut through the room, "Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is temporary." Evelyn's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" she asked, voice small. "I mean, you're not working. You're not helping us. We didn't sign up to house someone who can't pull their weight. You've been here months." He smirked, each word a pebble to sink her. "You're making it harder." Claire's eyes slid to the table. "Maybe it's best," she murmured, the words falling like a guillotine blade. Evelyn packed 2 suitcases that night, and the silence between them was louder than any battle cry. Claire didn't walk her to the door. Ryan didn't pretend. Evelyn's phone battery died that evening as if to mark the end of a chapter. She sat on the curb under a street lamp and felt the winter prick her face. She checked into the motel 2 blocks from the highway, a place with bulky elevators and a vending machine that ate quarters. In the cheap light of the room, Evelyn's grief and shame braided into something that made sleep impossible. She applied for jobs, nurse's aide, receptionist, any work that would let her be useful. But age and a sparse, recent work history were whispering obstacles. The world she had known contracted into a motel bedspread and the smell of stale air. 3 months slid past like gray ribbon. She texted Claire until the taps dulled her thumbs. "I'm okay, how are you?" No response. "Happy birthday." No response. Eventually, a single heart emoji came and then silence. Her money thinned, she counted coins like prayers. One evening, while taking refuge in a small cardboard box of keepsakes she'd carried with her, she found a leather-bound book at the bottom. Her mother's diary, tucked away between old Polaroids and ticket stubs. Evelyn had never opened it. She traced the worn spine and, with trembling hands, read. At first, it was ordinary. Weather, church notices, recipes scribbled in the margin. Then there was an entry that stopped her breath as if someone had clapped a hand over her mouth. June 12th. He came today. He said he wished things were different, that he wished I could be more than I am. He promised he would make sure she was cared for. He said his initials are VH. The diary pages whispered a story of furtive money passed in envelopes, of a man named Victor Harrington meeting Evelyn's mother in hotel lobbies and leaving her with promises softer than silk and more dangerous than a storm. Evelyn read about a trust, a letter, the name of an attorney, Samuel Adler. The entries were jagged with shame and tenderness, and in the script that her mother used to sign birthday cards was the key to a life Evelyn had never suspected. With hands that refused to stop shaking, Evelyn wrote a letter, not an email, but a hand-drawn, inked plea to the attorney named in the diary. She explained who she was, who her mother was, and asked for a conversation. Samuel Adler's voice on the phone 2 weeks later sounded like a hand reaching across decades. When Evelyn walked into his quiet office, crowded with books older than she was, he slid a sealed envelope across the oak like a consecrated object. Inside, the handwriting smelled of old men's cufflinks. It was a letter from Victor Harrington himself, the founder of Harrington Oil, a man whose face she had seen in newspaper columns for years, a man with a reputation as firm and unyielding as old concrete. He admitted everything. He had loved Evelyn's mother. He had acknowledged a child in secret. He had set aside a portion of his personal assets for this child, a trust to be delivered by Samuel should anything happen. There were bank records, account numbers, property deeds. The numbers shimmered like a promise. A portfolio, enough to rent a place with hardwood floors and not peel in the corners. Enough to change the trajectory of Evelyn's life. Evelyn felt a strange, cleansing thing when they told her the total. Not glee so much as a quiet recognition that the world could be different if she had the courage to let it. At the motel, she sat under the rented lamp and let the truth wash over her. She had been erased by the people who should have protected her, yet someone she had never met, a man whose name had hissed from black and white photographs, had left her an invisible lifeline. She didn't cry this time. She felt something else, an ember of resolve. Evelyn stayed in the city for a few more days, walking the streets of downtown, where coffee houses held conversations and people brushed past each other like ships avoiding rocks. She watched, not with envy, but with curiosity. The idea of being chosen, of being acknowledged as someone who mattered beyond the role of mother or widow, changed the angle of the light hitting her face. With Samuel Adler's help, she created a limited liability company, a paper ghost with no name attached, a small legal shell that could hold property away from prying eyes. She called it EM Ventures, short and innocuous, and began looking online at real estate auctions. She learned terms that once would have been foreign: lien, escrow, distressed asset, market rate appraisal. The internet was both a teacher and a doorway. Evelyn consumed articles about property management with the hunger of a person learning to breathe again. She found the listing mostly by accident. A small 3-story apartment building in Eastbridge. A part of town where row houses leaned into each other like old friends, and where many of the city's service workers lived. The building was listed as distressed, taxes unpaid, an owner who had defaulted. Evelyn recognized the address. It was, impossibly, the same complex where Claire and Ryan lived. For the first time in months, Evelyn had a plan that didn't involve pleading with her daughter. She placed a bid through the LLC. The auction rattled down with other bidders, numbers scrolling like a storm of confetti. When the final bell chimed, Evelyn's name stayed silent on the paperwork, but the deed, stamped, signed, inked, read as proof. EM Ventures was the new owner. It wasn't a caprice. It wasn't spite at first. It was a reclamation, the roof over a place where she had once been told to leave. But the first letters sent out to tenants were impersonal, professional, and cold. Rents would be reassessed, leases reviewed. For Claire and Ryan, the increase was not small. It was triple the market value plus overdue fees. The notification lit like a match dropped in dry grass. Claire called 2 days later. Her voice was a tremor in Evelyn's voicemail. "Mom," she said, "something weird is going on. Our rent. It's gone way up. Ryan's freaking out. Can we talk?" Evelyn let the message roll into the silent grave of old voicemails. She didn't return the call. Not out of callousness, but because this was not about cruelty, it was about consequence. She wanted Claire, perhaps more than anything in the world, to feel the gravity she had ignored. Evelyn went to the building sometimes at night. From a distance, she watched the curtains, light like small fireflies, 1,000 private lives flickering and fading. She kept her distance because anonymity was an armor she did not yet trust. She had no desire to humiliate her daughter in public. She wanted the truth to be unavoidable, to reach Claire through the slow erosion of denial. Repairs began. She invested in the building not to torment, but to protect. Lease agreements were tightened, security improved, transfers made legally transparent. Ryan wrote emails saturated with menace, each message an exercise in loud entitlement. He demanded answers. He threatened lawsuits. "This is extortion. This is a scam." Evelyn smiled when she read them, not because suffering delighted her, but because the balance of power had shifted in a way she never dared imagine. Claire reached out again, tentative voicemails, soft apologies, a hesitation that hurt Evelyn more than anything. The mother in her ached to say yes to the calls, to forgive, to patch the burned edges. But Evelyn kept the line closed. Silence in this case was not neglect. It was a slow pressure applied until Claire could feel what she had done.
The building's manager sent over quarterly reports. Photos came attached. Their unit's ceiling with water stains, a cracked tile in the kitchen, letters piling on the floor like confessions. Evelyn watched the statement roll like a tide across her laptop. Her ownership changed something in her. Not a thirst for vengeance, but a fierce clarity. She began to move differently, wearing clothes that fit her new life. Not flashy, but exact. She cultivated new rhythms. Meetings with contractors, late-night calls about insulation, security camera placements, tenant satisfaction surveys. Her life, once reduced to square footage and quiet dinners, opened into spreadsheets and small victories. And then, at the grocery store, she saw Claire as if she were a ghost. Claire didn't notice Evelyn at first. She stood in the cereal aisle, paler than her old photographs, shoulders hunched, a cart dotted with discounted essentials. Claire's phone buzzed. She looked at a text, set the cereal back into its slot, and her shoulders dropped. Evelyn followed at a distance, and when her daughter paused near the frozen food section, Evelyn felt something inside crack. She remembered scraped knees and whispered bedtime prayers. She remembered bandaged hearts and small triumphs. But what she felt most was a distance built out of tiny daily betrayals. Evelyn's new life did not collapse into petty calculations. She invested in small improvements across the building, repairs that made it safer for tenants, improvements funded in part by the increased rents that Ryan had so loudly denounced. She paid attention to the other families who lived there. Julia down the hall, a single mother working graveyard shifts at the hospital. Marcus, an older veteran who kept the lobby tidy. A bookish couple who left notes for each other wedged behind the mail slots. Her power had reasons beyond retribution. She found herself arguing for the safety and dignity of others, for things that mattered beyond her own pain. But the changes left Ryan rattled. He sought a face to his frustration, and as he did, he grew reckless. He phoned local title companies and made clumsy legal inquiries in pursuit of an owner. He demanded names. He stalked through the property manager's inbox unskilled and angry until the manager's quiet replies left him shaking. Anonymous envelopes began to appear under the office door. "We know what you did," one read. He scrawled threats in a hand he thought invisible. Evelyn recognized the crude handwriting in a way she had not expected. The pressed fury echoed the night he had called her unwanted. Once, when she was passing the building lobby after a meeting with a contractor, she saw their silhouettes through the frosted glass. Claire stood with her shoulders drawn in, and Ryan paced like a caged animal. For a second, she felt a hollow satisfaction, superficial, hungry, but it passed. She had never wanted to be the cause of anyone's ruin. She had wanted justice, a correction that would let her stand upright again. Night noises grew louder from their unit. Arguments after midnight, sounds of glass clinking as if tempers were shaking more than plates. An anonymous envelope arrived on Evelyn's doorstep then. Crude and threatening. "You think you can play us? We'll find you," it said. The scrawl was unmistakable. Evelyn folded the paper, felt the pulse of memory, and then called her attorney. Security increased. Cameras were installed, maintenance schedules tightened. She made public statements to tenants that the property was under professional management and that all complaints would be handled fairly. The legal team began to document and archive Ryan's attempts to coerce. Claire came to the door one rain-slicked night, clutching a grocery bag the way a child clutches a stuffed animal. She looked smaller than the woman who had scolded Evelyn for being a burden. She wrapped herself in a towel and let it absorb. She admitted, in a voice that sounded like it had aged 10 years overnight, that Ryan had been different lately, possessive, angry, crossing lines she couldn't excuse any longer. Her confession unmoored something that had been held in place by pride for too long. They sat together with tea, and Evelyn watched her daughter with a stillness unfelt since before the funeral. Claire apologized without prompting. She said the words she had never dared. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Evelyn let the apology linger like a fragile bird on a palm. She did not rush to return the hug. What was being offered was not a bandage, but the first stitch toward something whole. Claire left that night, and like many nights had before, she returned again and again, in small ways. She brought the diary once, a worn thing, as if rescued from her own forgetfulness. She said she had found it in a drawer, dusted it with trembling hands, and read through pages that broke and mended her at the same time. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I had no idea." Evelyn held the diary like a holy object and let her daughter see the woman she had become, a woman who had turned legal documents and quiet resolve into protection and pride. Her transformation was not theatrical. She did not become a villain or a goddess overnight. She attended meetings under the name EM Ventures, signed checks with a steady hand, and met with contractors who were oblivious to the family drama playing above their scaffoldings. She sat in on tenant meetings, listening and answering questions simply and efficiently. She spoke in the voice of an owner who knew what the property needed. When she finally revealed herself at a tenants meeting, to the shock of an audience and the distinct fury of Ryan, she did so without theatrics. "Good evening," she said. "My name is Evelyn Morgan. I am the owner." Ryan's posture slammed like a drawn curtain. He accused her of manipulation, of conning tenants, of ruining their lives. Evelyn looked at him with the same evenness that had settled in her since she left the motel. "I gave you a roof. I fixed problems. I acted in everyone's interest. I did not forget what happened to me, but I did not act out of vengeance. I acted to restore balance." The room hummed with whispers. Tenants lined up to meet her afterward, pressing questions and grateful handshakes into her palms. They wanted to know about the new security, about the paint and the heat and the boilers that would keep them warm. No one cheered, but the gratitude was small and steady and felt like a bell tolling for the start of something new. Word spread. Ryan became desperate. He dug through public records with an obsession that grew unhinged. He called the title company pretending to be a lawyer. He left menacing voicemails at the property manager's office, and then, when confronted, grew angrier, increasingly incoherent. Evelyn had her legal team collect every threat. When Ryan's methods failed, he lashed out elsewhere. Social media posts littered with innuendo, a desperate attempt at public shaming, fabricated claims that Evelyn had committed fraud. Then came the envelope. Not anonymous this time, but a direct threat sent to Evelyn's attorney.
"Undo this or I'll go public," Ryan promised in lines that crawled across the page. Evelyn forwarded the letter to her legal counsel and then watched as the legal machine ground to work. Cease and desist letters followed, legal records were compiled, and quietly, firmly, evidence of Ryan's harassment, forgery, and intimidation were sent to the right channels. It was a quiet, clinical knock at the door of his ego, and the thing his pride had been propping up collapsed. Ryan left shortly thereafter, not in a grand finale, but in a messy, ashamed retreat. Claire, who had been watching him unravel, found a tiny seam of courage. She packed up a small studio and left the apartment they had argued about for years. She took an art class, picked up brushes, and began to stitch herself back together. She painted a phoenix for Evelyn, dark strokes of red and gold that insisted on rising from the ash. Evelyn hung it over her fireplace and let its angry beauty sink into the walls of her house.
Evelyn sold the building later, not out of greed, but because she wanted to close that chapter. She donated half the proceeds to a local shelter for women and children, a place she had spent sleepless nights imagining as a beacon the night she sat on a curb. She called it the Grace House, after her mother's name, and insisted it be a place of immediate refuge, counseling, and job training, a resource she wished she had known in the winter when she had nowhere to go. The other half she used to buy a modest house in her childhood neighborhood, 2 bedrooms, a porch swing that hung under an oak tree that had shaded her as a child. She moved in quietly, with Claire's help carrying boxes and laughter that was tentative but true. They made grilled cheese on a rainy night and felt a small, ordinary peace. The road to forgiveness was long and riddled with things she did not say and things she could not forget. But there were nights when Claire sat on the porch swing and told Evelyn about a class she had taken, a painting she had sold, a friend who had been kind. They rebuilt language where debt and silence once lived. Evelyn wrote a letter, folded between the pages of her mother's diary. "Someday, you'll see you are enough without their approval," she wrote. She left it tucked where maybe Claire would find it years from now. It was not an act of cruelty to keep it hidden for a time, but a lesson in timing. Sometimes truth needs to be discovered when the heart is ready to hold it. More than revenge, the whole ordeal had been a reclamation of voice. Evelyn had learned how to stand without asking permission. Her quiet moves, the LLC, the purchases, the improvements, had been meticulous and legal and clean. She had used the same tools the world uses to keep people small: contracts, law, and money. Only she had turned them into a ladder. Months after the sale and the shelter opening, Evelyn received a letter from Samuel Adler. The building's final paperwork had been processed. He wrote, "You have done good. Your mother would be proud." Evelyn pressed the paper to her chest and felt the strange, mingled ache of victory and relief. She had done something no one expected. She had turned erasure into recognition. Claire began to show up for dinners more often. No dramatic reconciliation was necessary. Progress lived in the small things. She brought flowers. She learned to make Thomas's coffee the way Evelyn did. They spoke with an honesty that did not require apologies repeated like a broken record. They shared a quiet noon with the sunlight on their knees, and Evelyn learned to accept apology in increments. Months later, on an ad hoc afternoon washed in spring, Evelyn and Claire sat on the porch and watched squirrels bounce from limb to limb. Claire placed a hand over Evelyn's, a small bridge for 1,000 bridges left unbuilt. "I don't know how I became the person who could do what I did," Claire said, voice a fragile thread. "You didn't become her overnight," Evelyn answered, and they laughed, a soft sound that was real. "You made a series of small choices that turned into a habit. Sometimes those choices hide how brave you can be." Claire nodded, eyes brimming. "I want to," she started, then hesitated. I want to make a space where people like you can go. Her voice found its path. I want to volunteer at the shelter. I don't want to be the same daughter I was. Evelyn let the tears come then, not for the daughter she had lost, but for the daughter who had been found. She thought of the motel bed with its peeling wallpaper, the sound of the vending machine swallowing coins, and the pile of letters that had been her life. In the end, it wasn't the money that healed her. It was a story revealed, a truth named, and a decision to use the power she had been given to create safety for those who might otherwise be left on the curb. It is an odd, powerful thing to see the world rearrange itself around a new access. Evelyn kept the ledger of the sale and the donation in a small drawer. She kept a photograph of the shelter's ribbon cutting. Smiling children, volunteers with paint still on their shirts, Claire standing to the side with a paper cup of coffee. Small and human. Evelyn looked at that photograph on gray mornings and felt something like peace. There were nights when the old silence pressed against the windows as if it could come back in. She would open her mother's diary and trace the letters that had formed promises decades ago, and she would whisper, "Thank you," to a woman who had held secrets like lanterns. There were nights when she'd find herself opening voicemails left by people whose lives she had touched. Marcus telling her the boilers worked now, Julia thanking her for an internship for her son. Each message was a small stitch.
Evelyn never made a show of triumph. She never wanted Ryan's ruin to be a spectacle. She wanted justice to be quiet and precise. When the legal papers closed and Ryan disappeared into another city with his pride and his phone's cached bitterness, she felt no glee. She felt only a long release exhale. Claire rebuilt herself, slowly. She painted canvases that were loud with color and soft with forgiveness. Evelyn learned that strength needn't be loud. Sometimes it was simply the ability to refuse to be erased, to make choices that ensured safety for oneself and others. She never stopped missing Thomas. Some grief lived like a river that ran under everything else, always present. But the raw edges dulled, and where wound had been, gardens grew. Small, wrenched-up things like tomatoes and marigolds in her new yard. On quiet evenings, she wrote letters to women she would likely never meet, to girls in the shelter who needed someone to say, "You will be all right." In her new voice, she wrote about practicalities, how to draft a budget, how to read a lease, where to go when your heart is breaking. But she also wrote about the importance of knowing your worth when the world tries to tell you otherwise. Years later, when she walked past the old building she had once owned, she did so with a stranger's casualness. The building belonged to new hands now, fresh paint and new tenants. She watched windows light up like tiny living rooms, knew the stories would change, and smiled. She had shifted something in the world's axis. It was enough. One evening, as dusk softened into night, Claire visited with a small bundle of painting she had been making. They sat at Evelyn's kitchen table, sipping tea, the room warm with the smell of rosemary. Claire's face was more composed now, less hollow, more sure as paint settled into form beneath her hands. "Mom," she said, "when I was a little girl, I used to think our house would always be right where it was. I never imagined anything could move it." She touched a tiny canvas, a small study of the river where she used to feed ducks. "I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner." Evelyn reached across the table and took her daughter's hand with a soft firmness. "You didn't forget all at once," she said. "You just drifted, but you came back." They laughed and then sat in companionable silence, the kind that spoke more than words. Evelyn thought of the long journey from that cold curb to this warm kitchen, of the diaries in anonymous envelopes and the lawyer with kind eyes. She had been someone who'd been pushed to the edges and had returned to claim her place. She had used a truth to carve out a life that could shelter others. Before Claire left that evening, she tucked a small folded note under the diary's last page. "You don't need their approval to be worthy. You only need to know the truth and keep walking." Evelyn slid the note into her pocket, feeling both the weight and the lightness of it. Both were true. There was no pyrotechnic ending. Few stories of survival are punctuated by fireworks. Instead, Evelyn lived out her days with a quiet purpose, tending a small garden, volunteering a few nights a week at the shelter, showing up at community meetings, lending an attentive ear. She became someone who taught others how to stand not by force, but by steadiness. Power for her had become the capacity to hold others while also holding herself. At times, she still walked past the river where she and Thomas had once laughed. She would sit on a bench and let the current move by, and in that movement she sensed the passing of seasons inside her. She had been erased and rewritten, and in that rewriting had found new words to say. She had learned that revenge, in its best form, is not the burning of bridges, but the reconstruction of a life built on truth and service. On a bright spring morning years later at the shelter's new anniversary, Evelyn stood with volunteers around her and looked at families arriving with smiles brighter than their burdens. A little girl tugged at her sleeve and asked if Evelyn would join the ribbon cutting. She laughed and took the scissors, feeling the weight of decades fold into a single act of kindness. When the ribbon fell and the children swarmed inside like birds heading for warmth, her eyes met Claire's across the crowd. There was a steadiness there, not perfect, but brave. Evelyn had once believed unconditional love meant surrender. She had believed it was the thread she must never break, a rope across an ocean of uncertain currents. But love, she discovered, is not an obligation to be used and discarded. It is a living thing that, when mistreated, must be nurtured back to health, or, in its absence, recreated. She kept her mother's diary on a shelf now, its leather softened with years and handling, pages blinked through by new hands in the shelter's small library. Sometimes Evelyn read it aloud to women who needed a story of survival. She would pause on an entry and say, "This is proof that your life matters, even if no one told you so." And, sometimes, late at night, in the quiet hum of a house that belonged to her and not to the echoes of what had been, Evelyn would stand at the window and whisper into the old oak, into the small dark that had once frightened her, "I forgive you." She would say it not only to Claire or to herself, but to the long shadow of loss that had been stitched into her life. Forgiveness, she learned, was as much for the forgiver as for the forgiven. It was a way of setting down a burden and learning how to walk freely again. When friends asked if she regretted the choices she had made, if she would rather had had a different path that didn't demand legal battles and cold nights, Evelyn would only smile like a woman accustomed to hard soil and careful cultivation. "I didn't choose the hurt," she would say, "but I chose what to do with it. It taught me how to be careful with others and with myself." There were days when she missed Thomas in the small domestic things, the way he hummed when he read the paper, his slippers left by the hearth, but those things were now memories that fit into a shelf with other carefully chosen objects. They were not the architecture of her life anymore. They were ornaments that marked a history she could hold with affection and without collapse. Years after the lease signatures and the ribbon cuttings, Evelyn often found neighbors stopping by with small jars of jam or an extra loaf of bread. They would sit at her kitchen table and talk about the city, about their children, about the oddities of life. Claire would sometimes sweep in with a handbag heavy with paint tubes and take up the second chair. She had learned how to be brave, not by demonstration, but by moving through fear and choosing small acts of courage. Evelyn's story never became a cautionary tale or a grand myth. It was at its heart the story of someone who learned how to take the tools the world offers, law, finance, and restraint, and use them to rebuild her life. She had discovered that power can be quiet, and that justice, when applied with steadiness, heals more than it hurts. On the anniversary of the day she first opened her mother's diary, the day the first small ember of change had sparked, Evelyn planted a sapling in her yard. She dug the hole with the same hands that had once folded letters and sifted coins. The tree was small but resolute. She watered it and named it Grace, after the mother who hid truth in a book and in a life that bore small kindnesses. Standing on the porch, watching the new green leaf tremble in an afternoon breeze, Evelyn thought of all the women who would sit beneath its future shade. She imagined children playing under its low limbs. She thought of the shelter where laughter had replaced despair and the phoenix painting that hung above her fireplace. She felt, finally, irrevocably, at home. "Thank you for listening," she had once written in a note tucked into the diary for Claire to find. "You don't need anyone's permission to be who you are. You only need to find the truth and carry it with you." Evelyn had found the truth and had carried it like a lamp through dark streets. She had used it to light paths for others, and in doing so, she had come home, not to a house or a title, but to the sure-footedness of a woman who knew her worth and refused to let the world tell her otherwise.